How you doing? Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Educated Collins Snap channel. We're going to be talking about Loki today. There's been a lot of discussion about, is Loki too broken? Is Loki too problematic? And I just wanted to just put some thoughts and just some deck building ideas for how to deal with Loki, so that I think there's a lot to do in this matchup. So let's begin. All right, so first off, right, I want to talk about Loki in particular, just itself, what my thoughts are. A lot of people have been discussing whether to nerf Loki, change Loki, that kind of thing. I wanted to talk about it earlier, but I was busy, so here we go. So my first thoughts is that I do think Loki is overtuned a little bit, but fundamentally fine. So I wouldn't change the ability of stealing cards from your opponent's deck and making them cheaper. I wouldn't change that. I would maybe just adjust some points one way or another. So I just think like the gameplay is fun. The gameplay is fine. I don't really think, especially with Mobius coming out and things like that, that it will be like a super high meta problem. And already people are finding ways to deal with it. But I do think right now it's the strongest deck by far. So that in itself means that it needs some adjustment. So something that I thought was interesting was that when Loki came out, it had almost a 50% play rate. And I think that is ridiculous. I don't know how else to phrase that. Like, that's not okay. And even now, it's dropped to around 28%, which I still think is way too high. Personally, any one deck having like a fourth of the meta or half of the meta, anything like that, even if it had a bad win rate, I would still nerf it. Like, I just think that there should be a much larger variety of decks, regardless of how good they are. You know, you could argue like maybe a deck is like super fun, but there's too many players that like winning that won't, like, a fun deck that doesn't win will have a 50 or 25. Like, that's not gonna happen, right? Like, if decks just lose all the time, they're not gonna have a high win rate or a high play rate. So even though I still think it's too high of a presence, a lot of players are choosing to play different things than Loki, right? Like, if Loki's the best, which I would argue it is, right? People would just gravitate it because there's nothing to do. There's no counters. I remember making a Thanos and a Shuri video at the time, and like my response was like, how to deal with it? You can't deal with it. It's too good. It's the best deck here, and there's no counters. That was my answer. Here, I don't think that's true. I do think there are ways to deal with Loki, and you can also just design decks that deal with Loki very well. So, even though it's still the best deck and deserves some adjustments, I wouldn't change the base abilities, and I would just say like a lot of players are already gravitating towards something else, even though its play rate is still super high, too high. So I want to talk about some core weaknesses first. Right, just some things to keep in mind when you're playing against Loki decks that will help you. Right, so these decks rely a lot right now on Quinjet and Collector for large power, and large swings. As in, you play Loki after Quinjet, you can play tons of cards. Right, so you have a lot of that. That is something to always be keeping in mind. If they don't have Collector on the board and they're playing their card generation, right? Like, that's power they're losing completely, right? So that's something to always keep in mind, right? That's a big pressure point that is gone. So always be aware, like, oh, they don't have their Collector yet, and they're playing their Loki, they're playing their Agent Coulson, Nixir, whatever it is, right? Like, that's a lot of power they're losing. So keep that in mind. And the good games are telegraphed, right? If they go turn one Quinjet, turn two Collector, like, you're already behind at that point, which is sad because you could be like, ooh, I've lost turn two. But like, that scenario doesn't always happen, right? And sometimes turn four they'll go Quinjet Loki, right? So you can't always say, oh, they don't have Quinjet. First three turns we're good, right? But not having Collector, not having this, or but at least like if they are playing the Quinjet early, if they are playing the um, collector early, those are telegraph moves that you can say, okay, I'm going to be on in the back foot this game because they have like a perfect curve, things like that. And another thing is that Quinjet Collector can both be removed or negated by tech. So Quinjet being a one drop, no one plays Electra, but Killmonger can definitely do some work here. Collector as well can get Shang-Chi'd, can get Shadow King'd. Quinjet can get Enchantress, can get Rogued. So you can definitely you can add cards that do well into this matchup. Just to if you're really having trouble with this, there are ways to deal with it. I definitely remember the early stages of the meta. People weren't even running any counters at all, and they're like, "Oh my god, Loki beats me every time." And I'm just looking at their decks, and I'm like, yeah, of course, you have no way to deal with it. So I do think people are more wiser now, but it's still good to be reminded that you can deal with Loki tech cards. You can deal with Loki with tech cards. So just if that is such a big problem that you're in this video, might be something you want to incorporate. Now, the next slide is pretty much the main slide. I just have some, not all, but just a list of some good counter decks to deal with Loki. So we have Cerebro 3, Cerebro 2. These are really good because Cerebro's not really a card you want to be playing after you steal with Loki. It doesn't really buff you. Shuri Sauron decks. Sauron decks are the important part because it means you're running cards that need the Sauron to function well, right? Red Skull, Typhoid Mary, Ebony Maw, like these cards really need the Sauron to function well, so you don't get to do that last couple of turns with it, so it's pretty bad. High Evolutionary works pretty well since the cards you're stealing don't get the High Evolutionary buff because you're only stealing the base copy of the card, so you just get a weaker version of what your opponent's playing. You also don't have all the synergies. Forge Brood, pretty good because a lot of those decks do two things. First of all, they rely on Forge. So if you don't have the Forge, you lose a lot of the power. Second of all, it fills your lanes very easily. So let's say you have Brood, you have Mr. Sinister, Absorbing Man, whatever, right? Like if you have Brood Absorbing, that's 6 spots you need for that. Like, and you don't have the synergies, you don't have the Patriot, you don't have the Silver Surfer a lot of times. So it's just like not very synergistic with what the Loki decks do, right? So it's just not the greatest matchup, in my opinion. Discard is good because a lot of the discard effects are very specific. You need to be hitting specific targets. And if you don't hit those targets or you don't have the follow up, it doesn't really do a lot for you. So discard's just like a good deck into the matches where you pull a lot of stuff and they don't help you at all. Junk is good just because Loki decks tend to fill a lot. They tend to play a lot of cards, right? Especially with Snowguard now. You're playing the 1/2, you're playing the 2/3s, you're playing the Quinjet, you're playing the Collector, you're playing the Loki, you're playing the Coulson. Like that's a lot of like small things. So when you junk it up, like it just blocks their lanes and it's a really annoying matchup to deal with. Wave decks are good because Loki wants to play a lot of things. So if you wave them on 5, that's usually where Loki's want to pop off on turn 6. They play a lot of things. So if you wave them on 5, they can't pop off. So it's just a nice counter there. Combo decks, same kind of function where you need specific cards for it to work. And if you're Lokiing and you don't get those specific cards, your hand is kind of dead. Doesn't really work together, work well. So it's just a nice answer. Shadow King, Killmonger decks. Killmonger for the Quinjet, Shadow King for the Collector. You just shut those two main cards down, and as long as you're running like a functioning deck, it should be good enough to deal with most of the opponent situation. So that's good. Mobius decks for the future. I'm just future proofing this video where you watch 2 weeks later and it's like, yes, you can play Mobius. Yeah, for sure. Whatever. Destroy decks. So this one is very specific. You can't really play every destroy deck, but destroy decks that rely on Deadpool, Nimrod, those are the ones that really do well because Deadpool is hard to copy. You're copying a 1-power Deadpool, does nothing for your opponent. And then Nimrod, you also need to activate Nimrod. And a lot of times, what you're doing is you're going like Shuri Nimrod, so you don't have that full combo. And if you did, it's like a lot of investment. Destroy decks, right? They blow up the board, so it's not very clean. So that type of destroy deck doesn't do well. Normal destroy decks that don't like have any of that pieces are fine because you can just play like a death and null or something, and you can still do that in there. So it's a little bit caveat. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a full counter, but if you are playing like the Deadpool Nimrod version, you have a very high chance because that means 2 out of the 12 they have to hit to even have a really good chance. Patriot Surfer list, they're kind of like combo decks where same thing where a lot of your cards rely around the Patriot or the Surfer. If they don't pull it, they don't have the combo, and even if they do pull, a lot of their cards are not Patriot buffing, so you've just lost out a lot of potential there. So it doesn't really help them that much. Negative list and ongoing list, they're also pretty combo centric. They're the same philosophy. The only one caveat is like Iron Man could be a big issue where having a 3 power Iron Man is really going to do a lot for them regardless. So the best tech list runs don't run Iron Man, but I don't think it's worth it. Like you're not fighting Loki decks every single time, so Iron Man's just too good of a card to skip out on. But it is like something you have to be aware of, especially if they're going like Iron Man Mystique or something last turn. Like it's like kind of good. So it there's a caveat there, but generally in a lot of cases they're not pulling it, and the cards they're pulling don't help them that much. So those lists are pretty good. And Tribunal also is like full combo essentially, so they can't really copy that combo, and your ceiling is a lot higher than theirs, so it ends up working out pretty well for you. Now, on top of this, I also put some of the lists, like gave you some examples of lists. I didn't do everything because I got tired, so you know, don't mind me. But just Cerebro, just in general, I did a couple of like the main counters if you really don't want to struggle into it. I think Cerebro 3 in particular is like super heavy in the matchup where you can just mess them up super hard. Just be careful with Iron Man steals and then magic that can be negated with Hawk. So a lot of Loki decks run Snow Guard nowadays, and the Hawk of the Snow Guard will just deal with magic. So you always have to keep that in mind if you are like trying to do a turn 7 play and they haven't played the Hawk, or they haven't swapped it away with Loki, right? Because sometimes they do that where they'll play Snow Guard into Loki and then they won't have a Hawk, right? But some Loki players will be aware of that and they'll keep the Hawk in their hand. They'll go Loki first and then play Snow Guard, things like that. So just be aware that if you're trying to rely on the turn 7, which is pretty good into Loki's, but it can be negated with Hawk. So just some careful there. Shuri Saran, I think there's a lot of bad targets in this matchup. Like the really only good target if they get Shuri plus something else, right? Like plus Vision or Red Skull. Like that's really where things can shine. But other than that, if they're getting like almost anything else, it really doesn't help them that much. So definitely pretty good. And then if you're running the Enchantress can hit their Quinjet and really shut them down as well. So you have quite a lot of decent plays in this matchup if you want to play this particular list. It's pretty popular right now. This is not right. This is High Evolutionary. This is not Shuri Sauron. I just didn't change the name. But this is High Evolutionary. Wave can do a lot of work here. And then Loki steals unbuffed copies of cards. So this is just a nice list if you want to play it. Second one's Lockdown. First one is like the list I ran in the recent tournament. But I think it's pretty good in the looking matchup if you need it. So definitely just be aware of Wave. Wave really nice. Turn 5 Wave does a lot of work. So this is High Evolutionary. This is not Shuri Sauron, but works just the same. Works just as well. Next up, we have Forge, Patriot, Surfer. They're all kind of the same. Where it's just really just Forge into Brood into Absorbing Man. Still really good. Like even with the Absorbing Man nerf, still tons of power. So definitely something to utilize if you like. And the only thing really to be careful of is the Blue Marvel. It's just a nice card for your Loki deck, since Lokis tend to play a lot of cards. Like Blue Marvel helps them, and then Iron Man as well if you're playing Iron Man. So you just have to be a little bit careful of if they get lucky with their draws. But generally, most of the cards they're getting don't help them much at all. So it's pretty good for you. Doctor Doom is scary. The second list is not that um, great. You'd have to rely on wave for the second list, if I'm being honest. Like you go wave on 5 if you can in that matchup, and then play like Doom or Blue Marvel or Iron Lad, depending on what you need, or Chavez, I guess. Discard's pretty good as well, just because a lot of the cards they get don't help them at all. Like Dracula doesn't do anything, Mobius doesn't do anything, unless they're playing. I guess Modark Mobius would be fine as a final turn, but a lot of times they don't have like you're very reliant on getting your combos. A lot of times they're just gonna play like an Apocalypse or a Chavez and call it a day. So generally not the best deck list for them. And just keep in mind Silver Samurai on the final turn. This is just something I've noticed a lot where Loki players will play Silver Samurai. And what they're trying to do is they want to mill your Chavez or something like that, right? So that it doesn't, you can't like Dracula it, right? Especially if you don't have Apocalypse um, in your hand. But that could definitely backfire on them if you do have Apocalypse, where they just give you an extra proc on your Apocalypse. So honestly, I don't know if it's super worth, but if they are paying attention, then they'll usually be able to tell if you have an Apocalypse in your hand or not, especially if you play Modok beforehand. So you just have to keep that in mind if you're trying to do anything fancy. I remember doing a game where I played everything and kept the sword in my hand from Dakin, and then they milled my sword, and I was just like, yeah. You know, so yeah, it was pretty funny, but definitely something to keep in mind. Next up, we have Junk. So clogging the board does a lot of damage. They tend to play a lot of cards. So if you're giving them Black Widow, Debris, Green Goblin, like you can very easily fill their lanes. So that just messes them up really hard. As long as you have some type of follow up, whether it's like Infinite or Spider Woman, something like that, you can definitely just mess them up pretty hard. So pretty nice answer to the meta right now. Next up, we do have Destroy. So Destroy is okay, right? The one caveat is you have to be careful about Null and Death. Once again, I think those are like the problematic cards in the matchup where if they null you and you null, right, like you're getting the same power, so you really cancel that out. But that's 2 out of 12, right? Like that's always like at most they're pulling 7, but a lot of times they're pulling like 5 or something like that. They're not always getting like your perfect hand. So the rest of the hand really does not help them at all, right? So you have like 10 dead cards, and then you have like 2 that are decent. So you really have to be careful. But a lot of times your final combo on turn 6 is also really good. Like if you have a good setup with Deadpool, you can be pulling out like 16 power Deadpools and things like that. So that could be really good. You can also build a deck without Null or Death. You could do more Taskmaster and like Hulk Blaster. Those can work really well and be like a very annoying tool. And Taskmaster is a card that doesn't really work super well with Loki anyways. So that's something. There's probably a better list I could have put in there with Taskmaster, Hulk Blaster if I was really thinking about it. I'm not a big Destroy fan, so didn't really do too much there. Anyways, and then the last one I do have is just like some more combos. I was a little bit tired at this point, but there's like negative in there. There's like a Tribunal deck. There's like a Khazar, which I think is pretty good since a lot of times they're not really taking advantage of the Khazar buff, but you get to take full advantage of it. Spectrum also pretty annoying since they're not running a ton of ongoings a lot of times, so you can take full advantage of the ongoing while they don't really get to do that. So definitely some good cards to be playing, some good combo cards that just rely on like specific pieces, like Sarah decks also are arguable since they're basically you, right? In terms of the Sarah matchup, they're basically you because they have the -1, sometimes -2, and then they're better than you. So it's not super good, but usually Sarah is running Killmonger. They're running Enchantress, so you can just like mess with their list anyways. That's really how you deal with it. Hopefully it's not like last turn that you're starting to do stuff, but usually you're doing it a little bit earlier. So that's kind of the idea there. So overall, this was longer than I thought it'd be, but it makes sense. Usually when I talk about decks building, it gets really long. But that's the idea here. All I'm trying to say is like, if you're not doomed. You know, the Loki matchup is not doomed for players. I think that there's definitely decks you can build, strategies that will work, that will deal with it, and it's going to get better since Mobius is coming out. Maybe there's a nerf with the OT as well. So I just think that it's not too big of a problem. There's just a lot of discussion around is Loki broken? And I can see where they're coming from. I can see both sides, right? I can see where they're coming from and like, oh yeah, Loki's broken, but I will say the stats agree with you that Loki's broken for sure. But I think when I'm playing, especially in the tournament, high level play, I just don't see as much Loki, and I think a lot of people have like good answers and good tools, and you can see there's a ton of decks. I didn't list all of them either, right? There's just a ton of things you can do if you really want to deal with the Loki matchup. So that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I thought this was a better video than the video I was planning to make. But yeah, take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be